There are some other problems of meat production that we did not cover in our lecture on Friday. One of those things is that meat production requires a huge demand of both water and crops. We need water in order to grow the crops, but also water in order to water the animals. And then the crops clearly are providing the basis of the food for the animal's lifestyle. Because of these, it is in some ways a wasteful way of gathering food because of the loss of energy as you go from one stage of the food chain to another. So the consumption of grain by the animals is not entirely directly correlated into biomass of the animal. Therefore, there is a loss of energy. Along with the high demand for water and crops are the use of antibiotics and hormones with animals. So the use of the antibiotics is in order to keep them healthy for us, because think for a moment about life in the dorm. When you're living in a dorm, what are the odds that people are going to get sick? Everybody's crammed into a small area. Now imagine instead, sometimes you're even crammed into a smaller area. Let's imagine everyone in your hall was in your room. How easy would it be for one of you to get sick from the other? Pretty easy. So in order to deal with not having to treat each animal individually, sometimes people in meat production just treat everyone prophylactically with antibiotics. And hormones are used in order to produce milk, or in order to produce other substances, or as things to assist with readying for breeding. Milk, though, is the main thing that hormones are used to produce, because dairy cows only produce milk at certain times, usually within a year, year and a half, maybe even up to 2 years of giving birth. Is it pretty easy to get them to produce milk? Having said that, after that time period, it's not. So in order to get them to produce milk, we treat them with hormones. But of course, there's the other things that go in the animal feed that are a little problematic, perhaps, for human health, or just problematic to consider as things. Blood, bone marrow, fish meal. So sometimes it's the byproduct that goes there, but fish meal is a bigger problem, because when we feed fish meal, we are feeding them ground up other fish. And this is the same type of concept problem that we have with the grain and the cattle. It can take up to, well, actually, I've often heard that it takes about 4 pounds of fish meal at minimum to create 1 pound of fish. So that's a lot of fish meal that they have to consume. And if we would instead eat lower down on the food chain, it could be better for the environment. And we do eat pretty high on the trophic level on the food chain. If we were eating vegetables, if we were eating algae, if we were eating things that were low down on the food chain, then we would be more directly utilizing energy and creating it into biomass. However, by eating higher on the food chain, it is problematic. Having said that, with the exception of some large fish, most of what we eat is on the second level of the food chain. We eat sheep and cows and goat. Well, we don't, but perhaps other people do eat goat. Pork from pigs. Those are all things that are one level up on the food chain, one above the vegetable matter. Same thing being with chicken. I doubt any of you eat birds of prey or lions or things like that, so we're not eating very high up on the food chain. But there are some things that we do, especially with fish, because some of your larger fish have eaten multiple levels of smaller fish to get to that large size. Fish and shellfish production themselves have a whole host of other issues. One of the first issues is the industrialized approach we take to how we do fishing. And I could talk about some of the evils of this for easily an hour. I'm not going to. In marine biology, I spend a little bit more time on this topic. But the way that we do fish and shellfish production today is not just your fishermen going out and catching what they need for the day and then going back out the next day and catching what they need again. That is done some places, and it is done that way in some of our areas still in the United States. But elsewhere, and up on the ocean, it's done very differently. Fishing is now a fishery it is a business. We look at fishing as a business where you are taking the goods, the fish, and selling them. It's a commercial exchange, sometimes seen as nothing more. But the problem is that because we don't know how many fish there are, this is really difficult to do well. And within the fisheries business, there are a lot of different problems. One problem is the factory ship, the factory ships. The factory ships are where everything is done. The fish is caught, the fish is killed, fish is cleaned, fish is packaged, and then the fish is put on ice until later. So the fish can go from having been swimming in the ocean to in less than an hour in the freezer, which allows us to have really fresh fish. But these factory ships can take many, 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 many fish, thousands upon thousands of fish in one trip. So because we don't have to worry about hurrying back to the dock to get them processed, it allows the ships to stay out for longer periods of time and to take or to hunt or to fish and kill more fish than they otherwise would. Trawlers are problematic as well. These are nets that are going to scrape across the bottom of the ocean floor. As they do, they're going to disturb everything along the bottom and stir up the sediments, clouding the water, but also killing things as they pull them over, push them down, destroying structures. Fish finders are radars that you can have on your boat that allow you to find fish. I've often heard from people that one of the best parts of fishing is sitting there waiting for the fish to come to you and the reflection that you get to have on nature and on whatever else you want to think about. With a fish finder, you don't have that time for reflection. Oh no, you figure out where the fish are, you go right there, you catch a few, and you go someplace else where the fish are, you catch a few more. The fish finder is really great if you're having a bad day of fishing, but otherwise it kind of removes some of the magic of the concept of fishing from it. Spotter planes are even worse. This is done usually with our factory ships, where they will have a plane that is flying in an area near where they are, and that plane's job is to find the fish for them. They usually find them by looking at flocks of seabirds or dolphin groupings, shark groupings, looking for large concentrations of fish. They then go there and catch a whole bunch of them and they move on. Aquaculture itself is starting to become a problem. At one point in time, we thought that this was going to be what saved fish production. And China produces 70% of the world's farmed fish through aquaculture. And in 2010, they produced nearly half of all the fish and shellfish eaten by people through aquaculture. But in aquaculture, you are setting up an area that used to be the ocean, used to be a bay, a salt marsh, whatever, and you are taking away its natural kind of community, and you are putting in fish that you have hand raised, or at least raised in captivity, and you are going to fatten them up, you're going to feed them the fish meal, and then you're going to take them out from there and you're going to sell them. And it sounds like a really great plan at first, except, well, there's the fish meal issue. But then some of the other problems become that when the fish are in this aquaculture area, lots and lots of fish squeezed in the same area means a whole lot of fish poop. So it creates a lot of pollution, nutrient pollution. We also have the problems, like with people and like with our other meat products, that this many animals in one area is going to allow parasites and diseases to spread rapidly. And then there's also this fear that we have of what if a fish gets loose? The characteristics that make a fish good in aquaculture are very different from what make a fish good in the wild. And a good aquaculture fish is going to put on weight very quickly, but they're also going to tend to be rather slow at swimming, and they're going to have tamer traits than you would want in a wild population. If one were to escape, it could potentially breed with the wild ones and therefore introduce new genes into the wild population. So far, that hasn't happened, but it is always a concern that we have. There are a lot of problems with fishing today, not the least of which is the massive stock depletion that we're seeing worldwide. We are harvesting fish at a rate that exceeds the capacity of the population to sustain itself. It's estimated by the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization that 50% of global marine fisheries are fully exploited, meaning that we can't continue fishing them any more than we already are, because then the populations will not be able to support themselves. 25% are overexploited. This is where we're fishing at a rate faster than they're capable of replacing themselves. We may be fishing them to extinction. Up to 25% could support higher rates of fishing. This is based on the fish species that we normally fish. This isn't based on all of the fish species in the ocean, thank God. But fishing in the ocean is hard because nobody patrols most of it. No one really owns most of it. So it's that tragedy of the commons playing out here. There are 10 top species that account for about 30% of the fish caught in the world. So that should tell you that we do focus exclusively on certain types of fish. We find that when you compare the fish stocks from now to the fish stocks in the 1950s, 80 to 90% of our large fish stocks. We find that when we compare our fish stocks from today to the fish stocks of the 1950s, about 80 to 90% of the large fish stocks are depleted. And in a lot of these species, the fish that are harvested today are about half the size of those that were harvested about 20 years ago. Big-eyed tuna are 2 times as heavy, or were 2 times as heavy, and 8 times more abundant in the 1950s than they are today. And overfishing is our #1 threat to endangered and vulnerable fish. Smaller females are what are usually left after overfishing. They get smaller and smaller each generation. These smaller females produce smaller eggs than do the larger females. These small eggs hatch larvae that tend to grow slower, which then means that you have slower growing, smaller fish making up your population. I've mentioned that trawlers destroy the ocean floor. Bycatch are species that you catch that aren't your target species. This would be things like I'm going after tuna and instead I catch a salmon, which that's a bad example. You're not going to find the tuna and salmon in the same place, but we'll pretend that you are. Or I'm going to catch a tuna, but instead I catch a shark. And then with the bycatch, usually you decide, maybe I'll use that too. But sometimes the bycatch is thrown back. We call this a discard. In the discards, this would be the sea turtles, the dolphins, the birds, or the fish that you don't want. Discards are remarkably wasteful, and they are leading to, especially with dolphins and some seabirds and sea turtles, high rates of death in other species. We are currently fishing down the food web, meaning that we're going from larger fish on higher trophic levels to smaller fish on lower trophic levels. This can disturb the entire trophic levels, but also the food web, leading to potentially a trophic cascade. And fisheries is a great example of the tragedy of the commons. I've mentioned some of these problems of aquaculture already. I'd mentioned the pollution of nearby waters. One of the things I did not mention is that sometimes to make up an aquaculture pond area, we end up destroying wetlands or salt marshes or mangroves because it's right next to the shoreline, so it's an easy place to grow our food. And the carnivorous fish do need the fish meal. So far, the escapees haven't interbred. Well, actually, we don't know that we've had any escapees that have really posed a threat to the native populations. One of the things that we are doing in some areas to ensure that escapees aren't a problem is raising fish in one area of the ocean where they are not native. Therefore, even if they would escape, they wouldn't find another fish of their species to interbreed with. GMOs, genetically modified organisms. The question becomes, are they a problem or are they a solution? Before we talk about GMOs, it's important to talk about the concepts of crossbreeding and genetic engineering. Artificial selection is crossbreeding. When we take one plant and breed it with another plant, We are artificially selecting for certain traits. We're crossbreeding. We've used this to make seeds smaller, like in bananas, make seeds kind of non-existent, like in watermelons, and to make things like bananas sweeter. So crossbreeding is good. Genetic engineering is slightly different. It is the adding, removing, or changing of the DNA directly. So the difference between artificial selection and genetic engineering is whether or not you're breeding things together or directly modifying the genes. Genetic engineering is what produces genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. It does allow you to use genes that were not originally in that species, though, which is what makes it so separate from artificial selection. It also occurs at a much faster rate than genetic changes through artificial selection and crossbreeding. Sometimes the concern is that we'll be using genes from different species. Will that produce new allergens? Will it be compatible? Will it still work as well as we expect? Well, we're finding that you can get pretty big improvements quickly from genetically engineering plants. Maybe you can build in a pest resistance or drought resistance or a salt tolerance that wasn't originally there, allowing agriculture to happen in areas where it couldn't before. We know that genetic engineering allows us to produce hardier plants. The picture on this slide shows a plant with only a couple leaves and a plant with a whole lot of leaves. The one with a lot of leaves, that's the GM plant. It's a lot better. But genetically modifying plants to the point where we have a couple of really good varieties to go with does reduce the genetic variability and variety of the crops that we grow worldwide, which could set us up for a problem in the future. And we still aren't certain yet whether or not it's a good thing. Having said that, it is something that is part of how food is produced today. Should we have done more research? Maybe. Does it have the potential to do a lot of good? Well, sure. So not only might it allow us to grow food with better salt tolerance and better pest resistance, allowing us to grow food in places where we hadn't before, and not lose as much to pests, but maybe we can change it so that we can add nutrients to our crops that weren't there in the first place. But there's some hazards for GMOs. There are some unintended or unpredicted results. You mix genes from one species with another, you don't necessarily know what you're going to get. And not all of the GM plants have worked. There is a question of food allergies. There's the question of, is it going to be harmful to us when we mix these genes together? Will other things eat it that used to eat it? What will it do to the ecosystem? Is it adding genetic variability to the system or not? And then there's the question of, well, what species is it now? Because once you play with something's genes, is it the same species it was to start with? One of the other things that we get concerned about is, what if the gene doesn't work the same way in the new organism as it worked in this one? From a more practical standpoint, there's a concern of how to keep your genetically engineered plants separate from your non-genetically engineered plants. How do you keep the pollen from spreading? Can you keep the pollen from spreading? As you all know, pollen goes pretty much everywhere. We find that half of non-GMO corn and half of non-GMO soy tested contains GMO genes because they've been contaminated through pollen spread. This ruins organic crops because then they're no longer organic. There's a loss of biodiversity associated with GMOs because once we find a couple of good strains that work, we use those instead of our traditional ones. What this means is that in India, they've gone from 30,000 varieties of rice to now having 75% of the rice that they grow coming from 10 varieties only. We are replacing our natural ecosystems with the natural crops with genetically modified crops. In the United States, 97% of food plant species used by US farmers in the 1940s are no longer used today because of genetic engineering. We don't know if we're going to continue to keep making, we assume we will be able to continue to keep making lots and lots of new strains. But at a point, will we still be able to increase crop yield or add in pest resistance or salt tolerance or something like that? Will there be a point where we can't make it any better? We don't know. And what if there's a disease outbreak? Will these plants be able to adapt or not? One of the biggest concerns with GMOs is that there's been no significant increase in crop yield due to their use. And that begs the question, then why are we using them? They're not delivering the bang for their buck that they were promised. Why do we use them then if there's so much concern? And the answer may have a lot to do with how farming industries are done. Monsanto is a company that some of you have heard of, some of you have not. There's a lot of controversy there, but Monsanto owns a lot of seed produced in the United States. They also own Roundup, which is one of the top herbicide pesticide control sprays that we have here. We use it to kill dandelions. You can use it to kill other things. But they have made their genetically modified crops resistant to the chemicals in Roundup and the other pesticides and herbicides that they sell. Organic agriculture is a little bit different than what we just talked about. In organic, there's no use of pesticides, no genetically engineered seeds, no synthetic growth hormones, no antibiotics. It's farming using natural fertilizers and pest control without GMOs. Less than 1% of the world's cropland and less than 0.6% of the US cropland is certified as organic. Organic is appealing to consumers. It really is. It just feels healthier. But it's also very expensive to do. You have to have your fields organic for at least 7 years before you can even consider going up for certification in most places. There are a lot of problems then with food production. How do we go about solving all of them? Well, the first option always seemed like a good one. Let's just convert more land to cropland. Sounds great, but we can't do it. There's just not enough. Marginal land, it's just not going to work. We thought about utilizing marginal lands that could actually allow us to double our cropland area, but that requires the clearing of tropical forests and the cultivating of marginal land, making you irrigate more land. It's just not going to work well. These are lands that can't produce as much food as farming land as they're worth as other types of land. Then there's the fact that climate change is making some areas of land not good for farming that used to be good for farming. This could be due to a number of reasons. One is sea level rise. The soil becomes saltier. The groundwater may be entirely contaminated with salt water. And as that happens, this area may not be good for food. Drought. If there's not enough water, you can't grow your crops. And then changes in rainfall patterns, resulting in both drought and floods in different areas. There's already not enough water in some of these marginal areas to grow enough food. We're already overpumping our aquifers and overpumping surface water. If we continue to do that, then we're not going to have enough water for other purposes. There was a suggestion that we could melt glaciers, but melting glaciers won't solve this problem because meltwaters from glaciers won't be in the right locations to provide farming with the water supplies they need. So if we can't make more farmland available, we need to change the way we do farming. We can increase our food supplies sustainably. In order to do this, we must meet 6 major requirements. Protect soil from erosion or conversion, so keep it as farmland. Increase the productivity of existing farmlands. Reduce pest damage. Improve storage and distribution. Develop new food sources, meaning start eating things we weren't eating already, like crickets, seaweed, krill. And expand land that is under cultivation that is not marginal, that could be expanded upon. However, even if we do all of these things, we must stabilize the human population as well in order to actually meet our food sustainability goals. One of the best things we can do in order to keep the farmland that we have as healthy as it is to reduce soil erosion. You might remember that soil fertility is going to be related to the amount of topsoil that you have. So if we can reduce soil erosion, we can keep soil more fertile. These concepts are known as soil conservation, where you are conserving your natural resource, which in this is our topsoil. This slide shows 3 different ways that you can do it. The first is terracing, which is the first picture at the top. In terracing, you have multiple different levels of farming, and in between each level, there is some sort of a berm, or that high part at the end of one level before it goes down to the next. Each terrace level in this is going to capture the runoff soil and water from the one that is above it. And the way that these are set up, there's generally going to be no runoff off of the last level of the terrace, off of the bottom level. So the soil may still run off of the first level, but it's going to run down into the lower levels, thereby still allowing there to be topsoil. And if you need to, you could restock from the lower levels up to the top. Our next option is contour planting. In contour planting, you're going to work with the contours of the land. As opposed to making the land entirely flat, you are going to use the structure that the land gives. If it means that you have wavy lines of crops, you've got wavy lines of crops to keep them all the same elevation. By not changing the contours, you decrease soil erosion due to mechanical issues. And you're going to plant generally across the slopes as opposed to up and down slopes, because this leads to less erosion. This was something that was common in the past. We've gone away from it. Thomas Jefferson was known for utilizing this type of planting on his plantation. And there were records of him from the 1800s talking about little soil loss from this. Strip cropping is another way of erosion reduction. In this, you have alternating strips of different crops. And in this, you harvest each crop at a separate time. So if you have 2 different crops, you harvest one, and then eventually you harvest the next. And what this does is that instead of leaving all of the soil bare, it's going to leave strips of the soil bare and strips with growth. This is going to trap erosion because the ones that are growing are going to keep the soil there. They're going to trap it from going anywhere else and eroding away, whereas the areas that have no crop will grow back in time for the other ones to be cut down, allowing you to reduce runoff and erosion that way. You can also use plants to help with reducing soil erosion. Agroforestry is also called alley cropping. That's what you see at the top picture. This is when you have crops that are planted in strips between strips of trees and shrubs. The trees and shrubs protect the plants from wind. The shade that they provide decreases the temperature at the soil level, which is going to decrease evaporation and evapotranspiration rates, which in turn decreases your need for watering. So it's not only decreasing soil erosion, it's decreasing the amount of water that needs to be put onto your ground surface. Windbreaks are what you see in the bottom green and tan picture. These windbreaks are sometimes called shelter belts. This is when you have trees growing around the edges of your agricultural land to reduce and decrease wind-blown erosion. This also will increase soil moisture. It looks better, we think, than just having farm crops. But one of the things that agroforestry and windbreaks do that we had not anticipated is that they attract birds who like to eat your insect pests, and they also attract pollinators as a place to live, so that it increases the natural pollination and natural pest control of your farm area. Conservation tillage is represented by the bottom picture. When you till the soil, you're breaking up the soil so that you can plant the next set of seeds, and you want to be sure you get all the roots and things out of the way from the old plants. But in conservation tillage, you're doing the opposite of that. You're restricting the plowing of your soil significantly to reduce erosion. You're plowing only a tiny bit. No-till actually doesn't do any tilling at all. This is going to leave the residue of the previous crop on the surface of the ground, which is going to dramatically reduce erosion. While conservation tillage does reduce erosion, no-till is going to significantly reduce erosion. Both of these are being adapted by farmers because they not only require less work of the farmers, but they allow them to protect their topsoil. However, there's an increase in weeds when you do not till your soil, because the weeds are not disturbed by the tilling procedures, so they're able to continue flourishing and growing. Having said that, we still find that about 40% of farmers in the US, if they were able to use it, we would find, it's currently used by 40% of farmers in the US. And we expect that if we could get it to be used by 80% of farmers in the US, we'd actually reduce our soil erosion loss by more than 50%. We can also remove marginal cropland from production. A lot of soil erosion happens on marginal cropland. These are highly erodible areas. One of the things you can do to remove them is to plant cover crops there, so that as it goes back to a native vegetation, there is still something covering the ground surface to reduce erosion. Right now, the USDA is paying farmers to remove marginal croplands, and there are places worldwide where we really need to look at whether or not we should be doing much agriculture in them. We call these areas our erosion hotspots, and about 10% of the world's cropland is in an erosion hotspot. We can also, instead of having to conserve soil, consider talking about restoring soil fertility. Having said this, if we do soil conservation well, we might not need to worry about restoring soil fertility. We can use all different types of fertilizers to make the soil more fertile. We can add nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, potassium, all sorts of other chemical constituents. Animal manure is something you're all familiar with as a fertilizer, I'm certain. Green manure you may not be familiar with. Green manure is when we plow plant matter, the standing stalks and roots and everything, back into the soil, and the plants themselves decompose and work as fertilizer. We can also use composting, worm casings, vermiculture. All of these things allow us to enrich the soil with fertilizers, increase soil fertility, and thus increase crop production. We can use synthetic fertilizers as well, and synthetic fertilizers are gaining ground. They're used on more than 25% of the world's crops currently. We find that if we can restore soil fertility, it generally fixes the problems of soil degradation. But what if we could restore soil fertility by not adding anything to the soil at all? One way that we are capable of changing soil fertility is by doing crop rotations. If you rotate a plant that's nitrogen fixing, meaning it takes nitrogen out of the atmosphere and incorporates it as nitrogen that is freely available in the soil, this is going to effectively fertilize the soil for you. If you then immediately after that grow another plant, another crop in that field that needs nitrogen from the soil, it has already been fertilized by the plant you grew previously. Low till and no till soil conservation practices can also help with restoring soil fertility by not disturbing the soil so much and by allowing it to have a lot of organic rich material near the soil surface. We do lose a lot of crops to pests. A lot of crop material is lost every year to pests. And we've mentioned the idea of using natural enemies, using ladybugs and spiders to control pests, but we can also use parasites, bacteria, and diseases, things that would outright kill your pest. Sometimes we use pest hormones or pheromones or sex attractants, these natural chemicals that are capable of disrupting the mating of organisms, of preventing them from reproducing, of confusing them. And we'll see those concepts a little bit on the next slide. But by altering pest behaviors through the use of hormones, we are capable to make our crops safer. Sometimes we will spray crop areas with juvenile hormones, and this will keep them from maturing, becoming sexually mature, and therefore reproducing. We've been successful at doing this with mosquito control. Pest hormones tend to be biodegradable and non-persistent. They're also not species specific always. Some are, others are not. And this may mean that you could get them from one pest and use them for another. Another technique that is quite successful is the use of the sterile male technique. Some female insects breed once per lifetime. Once they breed, that's it. They will never breed again. If you want to be sure that they don't have any offspring, the best thing you can do is be sure that when they do breed, they do so with a male who is sterile, because that will lead to an infertile breeding and no offspring being produced. In a sterile male technique, we release about 9 sterile males for every 1 male that we expect is otherwise out there that is capable of producing offspring. On average, this means that approximately 80% of the matings tend to be sterile. It's pretty remarkable. That's going to significantly decrease your output of pests for the next generation. We currently use this in controlling the screwworm fly, and it works very well. This is a species-specific pest management, but it's not foolproof because about 20% of your matings are still going to produce offspring. Integrated pest management is a whole system of how you handle pests. You can use multiple different portions of it, or you can use all of them, really. It treats the crops and the pest as an ecological system to look at how you can control one by changing things in the other. One of the easiest things to do in integrated pest management is to rotate your crops. If the crops rotate, pests cannot get a foothold in easily, because instead of the crops being there year after year, allowing you to build up a large quantity of pests, we have the crops there one year and then a different crop the next year, maybe another crop the third year, and so on. So it does not allow you to get the large loading of pests in these areas. We use biological control, the natural enemies. Ladybugs get rid of aphids for you. It's a very simple method. You can use biopesticides. These are naturally based chemicals that plants and animals make that repel predators and pests. We find that our plants that are successful at creating biopesticides often switch small pieces of it as the species changes from year to year or over a long period of time, so that genetic resistance doesn't build up in the pests and predators, that they are fighting off. So genetic resistance here doesn't become a problem like it is with our chemicals that we make. Rotenone is made in Asiatic legumes, and it's able to affect many insect pests. Chrysanthemum makes pyrethrum, which is used for protecting home gardens, and there are a whole host of other chemicals that work. Now, you probably recognize we can't get rid of all the pests entirely, but what if we could trap them? What if we could make sure that the pests all end up in one area of your crop and you could get rid of them? That's what a trap crop does. You plant a low value crop that's actually going to lure your pests away towards it. And once they're there, you can spray only the trap crop, you can till it down, you can burn it, and that will allow you to control your pest population without losing your crop that you're trying to profit from. Integrated pest management requires a lot of training, and it might be expensive up front to get all of this started, and it's not foolproof. It doesn't always work. It may work better some years than others. However, it generally allows you to be cleaner in how you control your pests. And then our final way of fighting pests is through cultural control, also known as scarecrows, noisemakers, bug zappers, things like that. Inspecting your farmland and finding the pests and getting rid of them then. So we are controlling them through something that we are physically doing or putting in our fields. This is the example of using the pheromones. This is an example with a moth, a gypsy moth actually. So pheromones are species-specific released chemicals that include the sex attractants. In this, the gypsy moth males are lured to the glypure traps. These traps have glypure, which is the pheromone that the female gypsy moths produce. And the males are attracted to it. In the top picture, you can see that the male is going towards the female because he senses her pheromone. But what if we're capable of taking and synthesizing that pheromone? We can utilize it, like you're seeing in picture B, to trap the gypsy moth. So we line a trap with it. The moth gets in, and he can't get out. And therefore, he's not able to reproduce. It's going to control the population. Now, generally, it doesn't look like a large bucket like you see on the tree. You actually see a picture of a glypure trap next to it. Another thing that we use is either spraying or putting out multiple areas of glypure. By having it in a random pattern, the males are going to fly through it all the time and continue flying through it, trying to find the female. As a matter of fact, they may fly so much that they'll end up dying because they're not feeding, they're not stopping, they're utilizing all their energy. And by confusing them, you may kill them outright. But what it really does is it's going to reduce the amount of matings. Glypure is non-toxic. It's species-specific, yes. It's also biodegradable. And perhaps the best thing about using pheromones is that insects cannot, in fact, develop a resistance without changing how they reproduce. If the pheromone is the attractant that's necessary for the male to find the female, then unless they're able to come up with something else and the males are able to recognize something else, this will not work. They need to use the glypure for their mating habits. So aside from gypsy moths, we also use similar methods with the cabbage borer, European corn borer, cotton boll weevil, Japanese beetle, tomato hornworm, and the tobacco bud worm. Also some ways that we can change the way that we do agriculture to allow for more food. We can do more polyculture, where we have things that are more natural. And when you have multiple crops growing in the same place at the same time, there's less chance of losing an entire crop and therefore losing everything, because you always have other crops nearby. Also, by growing a combination of things, they're going to have varying depths for their roots, which is going to allow water to be used differently by the crop at whole. Some of your crops, if you're lucky in your polyculture, will fix nitrogen, allowing the others to grow better without additional fertilizer. This will also help keep down your pest numbers and increase the health of your ecosystem. We find that polyculture results in higher yields on average than monoculture does. And sometimes it's considerably more sustainable. You can find polyculture areas with up to 20, sometimes even more, different crops growing together. We also know that polyculture allows for better resistance to extremes. Because all of your plants are drawing water at slightly different depths, it's going to allow better protection to drought. Weeds become less of a problem because establishing in one area of the polyculture might not mean that they can establish in the whole region, because a different plant might shade them out or something like that. This provides more ground cover as well, which reduces soil erosion. There is the chance that we could go and do salt-tolerant crops, where crops are capable of living in, or at least handling, some level of salt water, either in salt marsh areas where there's saltwater intrusion into groundwater, or where soil salinization has become a problem. We can also look at some of the old crops and bring them back. This is something that we've seen happen with heirloom tomatoes, which have become more popular, going back to things instead of the normal large red tomatoes that you found at the store. The same is true with some potato species. We're seeing new potatoes coming to market now. Well, they're not even new, but they're new to most of us because we haven't seen them before. For a while, we were used to just having, baking potatoes, Yukon Golds, and red potatoes. But now you can get purple, different types of fingerling potatoes, and so forth. Then there are crops that are perennial crops. These are crops that grow for multiple years without having to be planted multiple times. The plant grows for multiple years. When this happens, it requires less effort on the part of the farmer in order to plant it, but it is also going to decrease the harm on the environment. It decreases the tillage, it allows for more stability in soil, and all sorts of other things. Going to organic, going away from GMOs can help too. Organic will help us improve soil fertility. Organic farming generally has reduced soil erosion. It improves soil moisture. It doesn't allow for synthetic chemicals. So the organic allows for improved soil fertility, reduced soil erosion, improved soil moisture, no synthetic chemicals, reduced air pollution. But it also benefits wildlife and supports biodiversity. We believe that organic farming utilizes 1/3 less energy than the industrialized farming does of the same area. So it uses 1/3 less energy for the same area. But, big but here, it produces 20% less food. That's a problem if we're focused on feeding more people. It also means that the food is going to end up costing more. Other ways that we could change our agricultural lifestyle include buying local. And if you're not familiar with the concept of a crop share, it's important that you learn about them. In a crop share, what happens is that members of the community sponsor a farm and a farmer. You pay a certain amount every week, every month, every year, something like that, and you get so many boxes or shares of their production, of their crops that they produce. It may mean that you get a surprise box every week, like many of my friends do crop sharing do, and you get whatever's in the box. It may mean that you're able to choose a little bit more, but what you know is that you are supporting a farmer directly by partnering with them in their agricultural work. This is showing you the roots of two different plants here. The one on the left is an annual wheat crop plant. The one on the right is a big blue stem, which is a tall grass prairie plant. As you look at it, you can see that there's a large difference in length of roots, but also just the sheer quantity of roots. These perennial plants allow for more trapping of soil, decreased soil erosion, and they're able to tap into deeper water supplies than our annual plants are. They might be a better pick then for agricultural work. One of the other things we need to change in agriculture is just how we deal with the inefficiencies in it. Irrigation is not usually very efficient. We'll talk more about that in water issues, but we need to increase our irrigation efficiency. We need to apply fertilizers better and make sure we're only applying what we need and not applying too much, and that we're using fertilizers that are environmentally friendly. But we also need to improve food storage and distribution. Lots of food never reaches that end user. It's destroyed by pests, maybe it rots in storage. A very simple way to do this is to have better storage bins that can cut down on losses. For storage and distribution, the more developed nations have the ability to lead and develop technologies and assist with other countries that don't have their ability to develop better storage. We can also just improve distribution, which may require the assistance of countries that know more about how to handle it, or in some instances of flood and fire and war, sometimes it requires airdropping food into an area so that people have access to food. We can also consider becoming less industrialized. The more industrialized farming is, the more chemicals it utilizes, the more water it utilizes, the more genetically modified organisms. And we're not really sure that this is best. It's not getting us any more food per se. It may not be getting us any less food, but it's not getting us any more. And if we instead considered becoming Maybe not entirely organic, but more environmentally friendly. Might we see our plant yields go up? Alternatively, might we just see that our energy input into agriculture is decreased, thereby allowing us to create more or create the same amount from less input, which would also work for us. We could consider removing bad governmental subsidies. We can also fund research into better agriculture. You all did the lab today, and you were able to see that you could come up with ways that we could do this better. So clearly there are a lot of thoughts that individuals have out there about how to do agriculture better. One of the other things that's not easily seen on here that I do have in my head as a way to do agriculture better is to have better transportation systems, to have a way to get food from one place to another easily. And it may mean that we can't take food everywhere, that maybe you will have people eating more local food and less food trucked in from other locations. But better transportation would help. We can consider doing more sustainable meat production that's more humane, more environmentally friendly. We believe that if we were more environmentally friendly, we would be able to dramatically decrease the amount of greenhouse gas given off by meat production. And truthfully, if we go back to open range grazing as opposed to grain, we believe animals could reduce their greenhouse emissions by 40%. So open range grazing might not just be a good thing for the animals themselves, it might be a good thing for the planet too. And we could go away from using antibiotics and hormones, allowing the animals to live a healthier life without those chemical constituents. And then the flip side of that is that what are the chemicals doing to us? We don't know whether or not these chemicals are harming us. We expect that they are. Because when we're consuming high levels of things that have been treated with hormones, we may still be consuming those hormones as well. There has been a question whether or not the way that we have started doing the meat industry is, or the dairy industry and all of this is related to changes in the age of when women first get their periods and how long it takes for them to go through menopause. Is there a linkage there? We don't necessarily officially know, but this is an area of study. There have been studies that come down on both sides of this issue. We could also consider feeding our animals parts of crop plants that we're not going to eat ourselves. In India, they do this using rice and wheat and corn and roadside grasses. So the rice, wheat, and corn portions that they don't eat of the plant, the straw that's left, their animals do. Same thing with roadside grasses. In the US, we're using salt marsh grasses and prairie grasses sometimes to feed animals, and it's working well. And then we can reduce our meat consumption. We can eat on lower trophic levels, specifically with fish, but we can eat more vegetable protein sources, and thus we don't have a high need for animal-based protein. This is showing you the comparative amounts of grain consumed by animals in order to get a pound of body fat. So it's showing you that beef cattle eat 15 pounds of grain to get 1 pound of body fat, whereas fish and chicken, it's a lot lower with about 4.5. Aquaculture has some great ideas to it, and it works if there's no problems. One of the ways that we've been able to solve the pollution problem of all of that nitrogen-rich waste is to grow algae with the fish, and the fish in turn may eat the algae, making it so that you need to feed them less as well. As I mentioned before, going offshore may help too. We might want to consider eating other types of seafood. This picture of the animal on this slide is a krill. Maybe we could eat that instead of shrimp. In case you're not familiar with large whales, they eat a lot of krill. Works for them. Maybe we could consider it. We should also eat lower on the trophic level. Instead of fishing at the top level, we should consider fishing lower down the food web, but not fishing down the food web. Those are different concepts. Then there's some things that we could just look into how we change things. Maybe we could reduce farmland conversion, taking farms and making them into other things like housing developments. We can develop new food sources. Algae is great great nutritional value. It can be expensive to farm, so there may be better ways to do it. Yeast is eaten all over the world, not much in the United States, but yeast has the potential to be a great food source. We can start eating native grazers in an area. Some of you, I imagine, eat deer or quail or pheasant, and well, probably most of you eat turkey. We can eat those things that are wild here. We can hunt them. We can fish for local fish and thereby decrease the factory farming of meat and the fish farming of fish. But there is some consumer resistance sometimes to these new food sources, and that is something we do have to overcome. We can remove bad subsidies. We can fund research into better agriculture and move away from Monsanto's models of business. Which brings me to my next point of separating your pesticides from your agricultural companies. We should not have the same people in charge of producing a lot of our seeds as we have producing our pesticides. That is highly suspect and problematic. We can also alleviate poverty. If people have more money, they will be able to feed their families better. Additionally, will be less likely to abuse the land when there is more money to be had. And it allows people to do things better, to spend more for organic produce, to be able to farm in a more sustainable way because they have the money to put into it to begin with. Because sustainable practice sometimes is the biggest barrier is not having enough money to put in to begin with. But there are some barriers to sustainable agriculture. The federal farm programs and subsidies support only a few types of crops. Long-term economics don't pay your loans when you're a farmer. You cannot say to the bank, okay, well, I'll pay you back in like 20 years if this thing works. It's not usually how it happens. You have to pay them back their money. Same thing if you buy a house. You can't say, okay, well, you know, I don't have anything right now, but if you come back in 3 years, I might have some money. It doesn't work. There's an increased cost with changing methods. But we're finding that farmers groups are providing education to each other and themselves. And they are focusing on how to do things better and changing the methods. They're buying the equipment, showing their neighbors how to use it, sharing with their neighbors. They're focused on genetic diversity and crop sharing groups. And universities are getting involved. One of the groups you all will love to know about is the Leopold Center at Iowa State that is doing considerable work in agriculture. Tenant farmers can also be a problem to sustainable agriculture. These are people that are able to live on the area where they're working the farm. They don't have any stake in it long term because they may not be there for a long period of time. They might have to move from year to year. And by not having a stake in it, they may not care for it as much. But the bigger problem becomes they don't have the ability to try new things. They don't have the ability to speak into sustainability there. There's also a shortage of young farmers. We need people who want to step up and become farmers. And then there's the fact that we need more legislative support, research, and education about how to do agriculture better. Finally, for February 23rd, I want you to watch the TED Talk that's listed here. And then from the articles on Brightspace, read 2 that were about GMOs and 2 that are about other things dealing with food. I'm saying read here, but a few of them might be videos as well. And we'll talk about these on February 23rd.